The rifle lay across the podium, its blued steel catching the flat, unforgiving light of the fluorescent tubes in the community hall. It was a beautiful and useless thing. Silas Blackwood's hand rested on its stock, his knuckles white. His gaze swept over the grim faces of the assembled ranchers and shepherds, 100 men and women who had come to him for answers and found only a reflection of their own fear. His eyes, however, kept snagging on the woman in the third row, the one sitting unnervingly still, her hands folded in her lap. Elspeth Gable. Her flock of 200 was the only one in the entire valley that hadn't lost a single head. Not one. While his own prize-winning merino flock had been decimated, hers, a motley collection of common Romney crossbreeds, grazed in infuriating peace. Blackwood's pride, a thing as carefully cultivated as his bloodlines, was curdling into a thick, poisonous rage. It was unnatural. It was an affront. The whole valley had judged her mad 10 years before. Not dangerous mad, just the quiet, pitiable kind that comes from grief and solitude. They'd watched her drive away from the county shelter that bitter November afternoon, with the dog on the seat beside her, and they had shaken their heads. A grown woman, a widow with a failing farm on her hands, bringing home a death row cur that wasn't worth the $5 adoption fee. It was the act of someone who had given up. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? 10 years earlier, the madness had felt more like exhaustion. The autumn of that year had been a season of finality. It was the first autumn without her husband John, and the silence of the farmhouse was a physical weight. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for her to fail. John had bought the 80-acre parcel with a dreamer's optimism, seeing not the rocky soil and the relentless wind, but a life of sturdy independence. He'd left her with that dream, 200 sheep, a mountain of debt, and a silence that screamed. The community's pity was a constant, gentle pressure. Casseroles appeared on her porch. Men from neighboring ranches, their faces etched with sincere concern, would stop by to offer to buy her flock, to take the burden off her shoulders. Silas Blackwood had been the first and the most persistent. He ran the largest operation in the county, a sprawling, mechanized enterprise of 4,000 head. He spoke of economies of scale, of the modern realities of ranching. He'd offered her a price for her land that was both an insult and a charity. "It's the sensible thing, Elspeth," he'd said, his voice dripping with a warmth that didn't reach his eyes. "One person alone can't manage a place like this." He made the phrase sound like a sentence, a life sentence. Elspeth thanked them, refused them, and endured their pity. She possessed the stubbornness that grew best in poor conditions, like the tough native grasses that clung to her hillsides. She also possessed an eye for value that others could not see, a trait inherited from her father, a man who could find a working tool in any scrap heap. The decision to get a dog was practical. She'd lost 3 ewes to coyotes in a single week. John had always handled the predators. Now it was her problem. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. Each lost ewe was a loss of wool, a loss of a future lamb, a loss of capital she could not afford. She couldn't afford a trained livestock guardian dog. The prices started at $2,000 and went up, far beyond her reach. So she drove the 30 miles to the county shelter, a low concrete building that smelled of disinfectant and despair. The place was a cacophony of frantic barking, a soundtrack of hope and fear. She walked past cages of bright-eyed puppies and handsome, pleading hounds. She was looking for something else. In the very last kennel, on a concrete slab marked with a red tag for euthanasia the next morning, lay a dog that did not bark. It was a large, rangy animal of indeterminate breed, part shepherd, maybe part wolfhound, with a brindle coat the color of dead winter leaves. One of his ears was torn, and an old, poorly healed injury gave his back leg a slight, stiff hitch. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a pale, intelligent yellow, and they watched her with a stillness that felt ancient. There was no pleading in them, only a deep, weary appraisal. He had seen the worst of men and expected nothing more.
That one?
The shelter manager, a tired woman named Carol, squinted at the kennel card. We call him Ghost. Been here 3 months. Picked up as a stray. He's difficult. Not aggressive, just shut down. And that leg makes him unadoptable for most folks. He's scheduled for tomorrow morning. Elspeth looked at the dog, who looked back at her without moving. She saw the same stubbornness she felt in her own bones. She saw a creature that had endured. Blackwood's words echoed in her mind. One person alone. She looked at the dog. One dog alone. She slid $5 across the counter. The manager sighed, stamped a form, and handed her a frayed leash. The community chorus began its murmur of pity before her truck had even cleared the county line. They saw a broken woman taking home a broken dog, a perfect match for failure. Elspeth saw something else. She saw a beginning. The first weeks were a study in silence. The dog, whom she continued to call Ghost for lack of a better name, chose a spot on the braided rug by the cold hearth and did not move except to eat the food she left for him, or to limp outside when she opened the door. He never barked, never wagged his tail, never sought her touch. He simply watched her with those unnervingly intelligent yellow eyes, a silent observer in her quiet house of grief. Elspeth did not push him. She understood the need for stillness, the slow work of mending a world that had been shattered. She moved around him, speaking to him in a low, conversational tone, narrating her days. Time to check the fences, Ghost. Water trough is icing over again. That north pasture is looking thin. He would watch her pull on her boots, his torn ear twitching slightly, but he would not follow. Her only regular visitor was Mr. Jakubowski, her nearest neighbour. He was a Polish immigrant in his late 80s who had survived things Elspeth could not imagine. He kept a dozen beehives on his small, immaculate plot of land, a property separated from hers by a crumbling stone wall. He was a man of few words, most of them heavily accented, but his eyes held a deep and knowing peace. He appeared at her door one morning a month after the dog arrived, holding a small jar of honey so dark it was almost black. He nodded toward the dog on the rug. This is the one from the pound, the one they say is broken. He's quiet, Elspeth said. Mr. Jakubowski looked from the dog to Elspeth, his gaze lingering on her tired face. He tapped the jar of honey with a gnarled finger. In my country, he said, his voice a low rumble, we have a saying. A cracked bell still tells the hour. He set the jar on her kitchen table. You must listen for the right sound. The old man's words settled in her mind and took root. A cracked bell. She looked at the dog, at his scarred ear and lame leg, at the profound weariness in his posture. She looked at her own life, the widow, the failing farm, the woman everyone pitied. Cracked bells, both of them. But perhaps he was right. Perhaps they could still tell the hour. The first frost of December came, hard and deep, encasing every blade of grass in a sheath of glass. Elspeth spent her days in the punishing cold, hauling hay and breaking ice in the water troughs for the sheep. Blackwood calculated profit and loss in his warm office. Elspeth calculated the cost of another morning, the cost in firewood, the cost in animal feed, the cost in the slow depletion of her own spirit. The arithmetic of survival was different from the arithmetic of greed. It had fewer columns, but much higher stakes. One afternoon, returning to the house, chilled to the bone, she found the dog was not on his rug. A flicker of panic went through her. She called his name, her voice sounding thin in the vast silence. She found him standing at the back door, looking out toward the sheep pasture. He was utterly still, but it was a different kind of stillness now. It was not the stillness of resignation, but of attention. His head was cocked, his torn ear pointed toward the hills. He let out a low, soft sound, a rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't a bark or a growl. It was a notification. Elspeth followed his gaze. Far out on the ridge that bordered the national forest, she saw them, a pair of coyotes, sleek and confident, trotting along the fence line, testing for weakness. The sheep were huddled together, a nervous mass of grey wool. Before she could even reach for the old rifle John had kept by the door, the dog moved. He didn't run, not with his stiff leg. He flowed out the door and across the frozen yard in a silent, loping gait, a fluid shadow against the snow-dusted ground. He didn't bark, didn't charge. He simply placed himself between the flock and the fence line, 100 yards out, and stood there, a silent, solitary sentinel. The coyotes stopped. They watched him. He watched them. The standoff lasted for nearly 10 minutes, a silent negotiation across the frozen pasture. The dog did not waver. It was a statue of pure intent. Finally, with a flick of its tail, the lead coyote turned and melted back into the trees, its partner following. The dog remained, unmoving, until they were long gone. Then he slowly turned, limped back to the house, and settled onto his rug by the hearth, as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened. The bell had rung. Elspeth knelt beside him and, for the first time, laid her hand on his broad, brindle head. He didn't flinch. He leaned into her touch, just slightly, and let out a long, slow sigh, the sound of a purpose remembered. That winter, a boy started appearing at her fence line. He was small for his age, maybe 7 or 8, with watchful eyes and a jacket that was too thin for the weather. He was one of the Miller kids from down the road, a family with too many children and not enough of anything else. He never said anything. He would just stand and watch the dog, who was now spending most of his days outside, circling the flock or sitting on a high point of the pasture, a silent overseer. Elspeth started leaving a thermos of hot cocoa and a biscuit on a fence post for him. They would vanish while she was doing her chores. One day, she walked out to find the boy standing not at the fence, but a few feet into her pasture. The dog was sitting calmly beside him, allowing the boy to stroke his torn ear. "He needs a better name than Ghost," the boy said, his first words to her. His voice was as quiet as his presence. "I suppose he does," Elspeth said, stopping a respectful distance away. "What do you think it should be?" The boy looked at the dog, then at the flock spread peacefully across the hillside. "Anchor," he said, "because he holds them all in place." And so he was Anchor. The name fit him perfectly. He was the anchor of the flock, the anchor of the farm, the anchor of Elspeth's precarious hold on her own life. The boy, whose name was Leo, became a fixture. He didn't talk much, but his presence was a comfort. He would help her fill feed bags, his small hands struggling with the weight. He'd sit for hours watching Anchor work, a silent apprenticeship. He had a preternatural calm that the sheep and the dog seemed to sense. He was the only person besides Elspeth that Anchor would allow near him. A quiet boy, a quiet woman, and a quiet dog. Together, they made a silent pact against the world's noise. The patient labour of the farm became a shared rhythm. Spring arrived, and with it, lambing season. Elspeth, with Leo as her solemn assistant, spent sleepless nights in the barn, the air thick with the smell of lanolin and new life. Anchor was a constant, steady presence. He seemed to know which ewes were in trouble, nudging Elspeth toward them with his nose. He would lie in the barn doorway, a vigilant guardian against the night, while the tiny, spindly-legged lambs took their first steps. That season, she did not lose a single lamb to exposure, or predators. Not one. The work was grueling, a litany of unglamorous tasks rendered in sensory detail. There was the summer shearing, the greasy feel of the raw wool, the buzz of the shears, the smell of sweat and lanolin under the hot sun. Elspeth learned to do it herself, her body aching with the unfamiliar strain. There was the mending of fences, the sting of barbed wire, the satisfying thud of the post driver. There was the eternal war against invasive thistle and knapweed, fought with a hoe and a stubborn will. Through it all, Anchor was there. He moved with the flock like a shadow, a silent, efficient force of nature. He didn't herd them with frantic barking and nipping like a border collie. He guided them with pressure, with presence. He simply walked toward a straying ewe, and she would turn back to the flock. He had an innate understanding of the invisible lines of territory and safety. The years passed, marked by the turning of the seasons. The first summer gave way to the first fall, then the first winter with Anchor as a true partner. Then a second spring, a third. Leo grew taller, his quietness maturing into a steady competence. Elspeth's hands grew calloused, her face weathered by sun and wind, but the look of brittle grief in her eyes was replaced by a deep, settled strength. She banked her success like a coal under ash, deliberately keeping it hidden.
She knew the community was not ready to admit it was wrong. It was easier to believe a thing was rotten than to admit you had been wrong to mock it. When neighbors asked how she was managing, she would just nod and say, "Getting by." She never mentioned the dog. She never spoke of her success. Her flock grew healthier, their wool thicker, her lambing percentages were the best in the valley. But she sold her wool through a small co-op 2 counties over, and she kept her numbers to herself. Her peace was a private thing, too precious to be exposed to the winds of local opinion. Silas Blackwood would stop by once or twice a year, his big, shiny truck a jarring intrusion in her quiet world. He'd lean against his fender, surveying her land with a proprietary air. His offers became less frequent, his tone shifting from false pity to a kind of baffled condescension. He couldn't understand why she was still there, why she hadn't failed.
"Still hanging on, Elspeth?" he asked one summer afternoon, 5 years after Anchor had arrived. He gestured toward her flock grazing peacefully on the far hill. Anchor was a small, dark shape sitting sentinel above them. "You know, I could get you a real dog, a trained Kelpie, best bloodlines. That junkyard mutt of yours is probably carrying all sorts of diseases." Elspeth just looked at him, her silence a more powerful reply than any argument. Being right was its own kind of answer, and she knew that silence unnerved men like Blackwood far more than words. He squinted at the dog. "Surprised he hasn't turned on the sheep. It's in the blood of a stray to be unreliable. You'll see. One day you'll come out here and find a massacre." He was wrong. The only massacres were happening elsewhere. A quiet plague was creeping through the valley. The coyote population, always a nuisance, had exploded. But it wasn't just coyotes anymore. A small wolf pack, pushed down from the high country by a series of mild winters that had inflated the deer herds, had established a territory at the edge of the valley. At first, it was just rumors. A lost calf here, a deer carcass there. Then it became real. The winter of the 10th year was the reckoning. It came in with a savage fury, burying the valley in snow deeper than anyone had seen in a generation. The cold was a physical entity, a predator in its own right. Deer and elk, starving in the high country, moved down into the ranch lands in unprecedented numbers, and the wolves followed them. The coyotes, emboldened by hunger, grew brazen. Fences, even the expensive electric ones Blackwood had installed, meant nothing. The predators learned to dig under or leap over. They were smart, and they were desperate. The stories began to trickle in, then they became a flood. 10 ewes lost in one night at the Miller place, 15 from the Carlson Ranch. The losses were catastrophic.
The ranchers responded with rifles and traps, but it was like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. For every predator they killed, two more seemed to take its place. The valley, which had once been filled with the gentle sound of grazing sheep, was now punctuated by the crack of rifles in the night and the grim talk of loss in the town's only diner. Silas Blackwood was hit the hardest. His vast open pastures, so efficient in peacetime, became a killing field. His shepherds, who managed the flock with ATVs and drones, were helpless against the silent nocturnal raids. He lost 30 head in 1 week, then 50 the next. His prize-winning merinos, bred for the finest fleece, had been bred for docility. They had no idea how to defend themselves. They would scatter in panic, making them easy prey. Through it all, Elspeth's farm remained an island of tranquility. Her 80 acres were a sanctuary. Her sheep, accustomed to the constant calm presence of their guardian, did not panic. When a threat approached, they did not scatter. They bunched tightly together behind Anchor. And Anchor was magnificent. He was old now, his muzzle greyed and his limp more pronounced, but his spirit was undiminished. He seemed to sense the predators long before they reached the fence line. He would move to the threatened border, a silent, unbreachable wall of intent. He never had to fight. His presence was enough. The wolves, intelligent creatures that they were, understood the arithmetic of risk. A fight with this silent, implacable guardian was a fight not worth having when there were easier meals just over the ridge. The community's mockery, which had long ago curdled into pity, now began to curdle again, this time into a bewildered suspicion. How was it possible? Luck could not account for it. Whispers started. People driving past her property would slow down, staring at the lone, brindled dog sitting on the hill as if he were some kind of supernatural creature. It was easier to believe the dog was a freak of nature, a thing of myth, than to admit their own judgment had been wrong for a decade. Their scorn had been a form of blindness, and now they were being forced to see. The desperation in the valley reached its peak in late February at the emergency meeting of the Wool Growers Association, held in the grimly lit community hall. Silas Blackwood stood at the podium, his face a mask of fury and exhaustion. The rifle he displayed was a symbol of his impotence. He spoke of lobbying the government for a cull, of setting up a bounty system, of war. His solutions were loud, expensive, and violent. As he spoke, his eyes kept returning to Elspeth. The silence from her farm was louder than all his losses. After the meeting, as people milled about, their faces grim, Blackwood approached her. He cornered her near the coffee urn, his large frame blocking her path. "All right, Elspeth," he said, his voice low and stripped of all its false warmth. "What's your trick? Some kind of newfangled scent repellent? You've got something going on over there." "I have a good dog," she said, her voice level. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "That old stray? Don't insult my intelligence. No dog can stand up to a wolf pack. I've seen what they do." His eyes narrowed. "I've been watching your flock. My foreman counted them from the road with his binoculars last week. 212 head, including the new lambs. You haven't lost a single one, have you?" It was a fatal slip. The number was exact, private. He should not have known it. He had been spying on her, not just observing, but counting, calculating. He had been measuring her success while publicly dismissing her methods. He had betrayed his own obsession, his own greed. Elspeth looked at him, and for the first time he saw not a pitiable widow, but something as hard and unyielding as the granite in her hills. The arithmetic of survival had made her strong. The arithmetic of greed had made him desperate. 212, she confirmed quietly. "And Anchor is a good dog." Blackwood's face flushed. He was a man accustomed to holding all the cards, to setting the price of everything.
Now he found himself facing a value he could not calculate and could not purchase. "I want to buy him," he said, the words torn from him. "The dog. Name your price. 5,000, 10, whatever you want." The small cluster of ranchers nearby fell silent, turning to listen. The offer hung in the air, obscene in its desperation. $10,000 for a dog he had called a worthless stray. Elspeth looked past Blackwood to the faces of her neighbours. She saw the Millers, who had lost half their flock. She saw old Mr. Carlson, his shoulders slumped in defeat. These were the people who had pitied her, who had mocked her choice. But they were also her community, broken and bleeding. She held all the power now. She could have her revenge. She could name an impossible price, humiliate Blackwood, and walk away, secure in her own small victory. But Mr. Jakubowski's words came back to her. A cracked bell still tells the hour. A community was also a kind of bell. Theirs was cracked, shattered by loss and fear. But perhaps it could be made to ring true again. The arithmetic of grace was different from the arithmetic of revenge. She turned her gaze back to Blackwood, but her words were for everyone in the room. "Is not for sale." A murmur went through the crowd. Blackwood's face hardened. "Everything has a price, Elspeth." "Not everything," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried in the sudden stillness of the hall. "But it happens. He sired a litter of pups last spring, a neighbour's blue heeler. There are 4 left." A spark of hope ignited in the room. Blackwood saw his opening. "I'll take all 4, he said instantly. $1,000 each. He was trying to control the market again, to buy the solution. Elspeth gave a small, sad shake of her head. He still didn't understand. Value was not the same as price. Worth was what a thing becomes, not what it costs. "The pups will go to my neighbours," she announced, her eyes meeting the gazes of the Millers and the Carlsons and the others. "To anyone in this valley who has lost sheep to the predators. They can have their pick." "And the price?" Blackwood asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Elspeth looked him straight in the eye. "The price," she said, a voice clear and final, "is $5 each, the same price I paid for their father at the county shelter." The silence in the hall was absolute. It was a silence of astonishment, of shame, of a profound and sudden reordering of the world. Blackwood stood as if struck, his face a canvas of disbelief and humiliation. He had been defeated, not by force or by money, but by an act of generosity, so simple and so profound it was unanswerable. He had offered a fortune, and she had countered with a pittance that was worth infinitely more. He had tried to buy a dog, and she had offered to rebuild a community. Without another word, he turned and pushed his way through the stunned crowd, the useless rifle still in his hand. He had been shamed not by her anger, but by her grace. The coda to the long, harsh winter was a gentle spring. The green returned to the hillsides, and with it, a fragile sense of hope. 4 brindle puppies, all with their father's solemn yellow eyes, went to 4 different farms in the valley. Elspeth and Leo delivered them personally, giving quiet instructions on how to work with the dogs, how to earn their trust, how to listen for the right sound. It was the beginning of a new kind of ranching in the valley, one built not on fences and firearms, but on partnership and guardianship. The community, bound by a shared crisis and a shared unexpected salvation, began to mend. Neighbours started helping neighbours again, sharing information, creating a cooperative network of defence. The cracked bell of their community began slowly to tell the hour once more. One warm evening in late summer, Elspeth sat on her porch watching her flock graze in the golden light. The farm was no longer failing, it was thriving, a quiet testament to a decade of patient labour. Anchor, now old and content, lay at her feet, his head resting on her boots.
Leo, now a lanky teenager with a quiet confidence that mirrored her own, worked on repairing a harness nearby. He was her partner in all things now, the son she'd never had. Mr. Jakubowski walked over from his property, carrying 2 small glasses and a bottle of his golden mead. He handed one to Elspeth and sat down in the other rocking chair. For a long time, they watched the sheep and the old dog in comfortable silence. "A good dog," Mr. Jakubowski said at last, raising his glass. "The best," Elspeth agreed. The old man smiled, a network of fine wrinkles spreading from the corners of his eyes. He looked at the peaceful farm, at the boy, at the woman who was no longer alone. He took a slow sip of his mead. "You see," he said softly, his voice full of a gentle, final wisdom. "A cracked bell. It still tells the hour, and everyone can hear it now."